The first person to know a man needed an ambulance wasn't the police, not the ambulance crew, not even the people who eventually found him. It was the person who called 999. A seriously injured man had been reported. Within minutes, an ambulance was on its way. Police and emergency crews searched exactly where the caller had directed them. Nothing. No injured man. No emergency. The incident was recorded as a false alarm. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. Perhaps the caller had made a mistake. Then, 28 minutes later, another 999 call came in. A different location was given. There, police found the victim. His name was Anthony Litler. Suddenly, the first explanation no longer fit. That original call had come only minutes after Anthony was attacked. Long before anyone found him. Before anyone even knew he was missing. Only one possibility remained. Whoever called 999 already knew an ambulance was needed. One question was left unanswered. How could someone know that before anyone else? To answer it, we have to go back to the beginning. Anthony Litler lived a life built on routine. He was 45 years old. By day, he worked as an executive officer with Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, a position that demanded precision, discipline, and discretion. He lived alone near East Finchley Underground Station. Friends remembered one detail above all. Anthony stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, yet the description that surfaced again and again was gentle giant. His height made him noticeable. His quiet nature made him unforgettable. Monday evenings followed a familiar pattern. Anthony traveled across London to attend meetings of the Ponds branch of the Society for the Preservation of Beer from the Wood, a group devoted to traditional cask ales and historic brewing methods. It was a hobby he'd enjoyed for years, and one built around a routine that rarely changed. On the evening of April 30th, 1984, everything unfolded exactly as expected. He attended the Society's scheduled meeting in Carshalton. The evening passed without incident. Friends later recalled no arguments, no confrontation. Nothing suggested the journey home would be any different from countless others before it. Shortly after midnight, Anthony returned to North London on the Northern Line. Transport records later showed his train arrived at East Finchley Underground Station at about 12:18 a.m. Roughly 2 minutes later, the station foreman watched Anthony leave the ticket hall. Before Anthony walked away, the foreman wished him good night. It was an ordinary exchange. Years later, investigators would realize it marked the last confirmed sighting of Anthony Litler alive. Several routes led from the station to his home. Anthony chose the one he knew best, the Causeway, a narrow footpath behind East Finchley Underground Station, used by local residents as the quickest route home. He turned onto the path. Then he disappeared from public view. Nothing about the walk suggested it would be his last. The next 2 minutes would become the most important 2 minutes in the entire investigation. At about 12:20 a.m., Anthony Litler stepped into the Causeway. The shortcut was familiar. It ran behind East Finchley Underground Station, narrowing between a railway retaining wall, dense vegetation, and a block of public conveniences. Within a few steps, anyone using the path disappeared from view. Anthony never reached the other end. Investigators later reconstructed what happened from the evidence left at the scene and the surviving records. The attack was sudden. A blunt instrument inflicted catastrophic head injuries. Anthony collapsed where he fell. Everything happened within an extraordinarily small window of time. Anthony left the station at about 12:20 a.m. Just 2 minutes later, at 12:22 a.m., a young-sounding caller used a nearby public telephone box to dial 999. The caller reported a badly injured man outside East Finchley Underground Station. Before the operator could get a name or a more precise location, the caller hung up. The report triggered an immediate emergency response. Police officers, station staff, and ambulance crews searched exactly where the caller had directed them. They checked the station entrance. Then the forecourt, then the surrounding streets. They found no injured man, no sign of violence, no witness waiting to guide them. At 12:40 a.m., the incident was stood down and recorded as a false alarm. Anthony Litler had never been outside the station. He was still lying inside the causeway. Emergency services had responded within minutes. They had searched exactly where they had been told. Yet the man they were looking for was never there. The question was no longer what had happened during those 2 minutes. It was why the first caller had sent them there in the first place. The first emergency response arrived within minutes. Police officers, ambulance crews, and station staff searched exactly where the anonymous caller had directed them. Outside East Finchley Underground Station, they found nothing. At first, it sounds like the search had failed. It hadn't. Responders searched the station forecourt. They checked the high road. They looked for anyone matching the caller's description. There was nobody to find. Anthony Litler had never been outside the station. He was still lying inside the causeway. The search ended because responders had examined every location they had been told to check. Nothing there matched the emergency call. The incident was recorded as a false alarm. Police and paramedics left. Anthony remained alone in the darkness behind the station. About 10 minutes passed. Nothing changed. No one reached Anthony. No one reported the attack. Then 2 more people entered the causeway. James and Annalise Hange weren't searching for anyone. They were simply walking home, taking the same shortcut Anthony had used earlier that night. Within moments, they were about to find what the first emergency response never had. About 10 minutes after the first search ended, James and Annalise Hange stepped off a later train at East Finchley Underground Station. Like Anthony Litler before them, they took the causeway, the quickest route home. They weren't looking for anyone. They expected an ordinary walk. Instead, they saw a man lying across the path. As they drew closer, they realized he had suffered devastating head injuries. James stayed with Anthony. Annalise turned and ran back toward the high road to find a public telephone. At 12:58 a.m., she dialed 999. This call was different from the first. She didn't report an injured man outside the station. She told the operator exactly where Anthony was, the causeway. This time, there was no uncertainty. Police and paramedics went straight to the footpath behind East Finchley Underground Station. They found Anthony exactly where Annalise said he would be. He never regained consciousness. The attack that had unfolded only minutes earlier was now a homicide investigation. By daylight, investigators knew remarkably little. There was no eyewitness to the assault, no identified attacker, no murder weapon. Only a victim, a narrow footpath, and 2 emergency calls that appeared to tell completely different stories. At first, those calls seemed unrelated. One had sent emergency services on an empty search. The other had led them to Anthony Litler. For years, detectives treated them as separate events. They had no reason to think otherwise. By sunrise, the search for Anthony Littler's attacker had become a murder investigation. Detectives secured the scene. They interviewed witnesses. They reconstructed Anthony's final movements. Every confirmed fact came under scrutiny. At first, investigators focused on the most obvious motive: robbery. The evidence quickly challenged that theory. Anthony's wallet was still with him. His briefcase remained beside him. Nothing of obvious value had been taken. One possibility had been ruled out. Only one major lead remained: the anonymous 999 caller. Whoever made that call knew an injured man needed an ambulance only minutes after the attack. Finding that caller became one of the investigation's highest priorities. Detectives appealed for information. They followed every lead available. They interviewed anyone who might identify the anonymous voice. Nothing led them to the caller. The investigation wasn't brief. It wasn't careless. It was thorough. Yet every significant inquiry returned to the same unanswered question: who made the first 999 call? Without that answer, detectives had no reason to believe the 2 emergency calls were connected. One described an injured man outside East Finchley Underground Station. The other led police to Anthony inside the causeway. They appeared to describe two separate incidents. Nothing in the evidence suggested otherwise. Months passed. New information stopped coming. The anonymous caller remained unidentified. The investigation had reached the limit of what the available evidence could reveal. The case wasn't abandoned. It was exhausted. If every available lead had already been followed, what could possibly bring this investigation back to life 40 years later? By the beginning of 1985, the investigation had reached its limit. The file was closed. Not because detectives believed they'd solved Anthony Littler's murder, because they'd exhausted every lead they could pursue. Years passed without a breakthrough. A formal review in 1993 found no new witnesses, no overlooked evidence, no new line of inquiry. The file went back into storage. Time created a different problem. Evidence that often solves cold cases was disappearing. Detectives later searched more than 200 archived property crates, hoping the original exhibits had survived. They found nothing. Anthony's clothing had vanished. The physical exhibits were gone. The suspected murder weapon had never been recovered. By every conventional measure, the investigation should have ended there. Then, in 2019, Detective Chief Inspector Neil John inherited the case after joining the Metropolitan Police Specialist Crime Command. 3 years later, detectives formally reopened the investigation. Not because new evidence had appeared, because they believed the surviving investigation deserved another look. Their first task wasn't finding a suspect. It was understanding how detectives in 1984 had understood the murder. The paper file had survived. Witness statements, train records, ambulance logs, police communications, interview notebooks. No single document identified Anthony's killer. Taken together, they preserved the investigation exactly as it had unfolded. For the first time in decades, detectives asked a different question. Not, what new evidence can we find? But what if the old evidence had never been fully understood? The case wasn't returning because something new had been discovered. It was returning because someone believed the old file still had more to say. The next challenge wasn't finding new evidence. It was discovering what 40-year-old records had been hiding in plain sight. The new investigation didn't begin with a search for new evidence. It began with a different question. What if the original investigation had already collected everything it needed, but no one had ever assembled it into one complete sequence? Detectives reopened every surviving record. Archived witness statements, transport for London train logbooks, ambulance dispatch records, police radio communications, telephone logs. Each document had been created independently. None had been written to explain the murder. Together, they described the same night. For the first time, investigators stopped reading those records as separate documents. Instead, they arranged every confirmed event into a single, minute-by-minute timeline. Every statement was checked against an independent record. Every recorded movement was measured. Walking times were tested. Emergency response times were verified. Nothing was accepted simply because it had always been believed. Then something unexpected happened. The more precisely detectives rebuilt the timeline, the smaller the window became. Between Anthony leaving the station, the attack, the attackers leaving, and the anonymous 999 call, only a matter of minutes remained. That was the breakthrough. Not a new witness, not new forensic evidence. Mathematics. The reconstructed timeline no longer left enough time for an uninvolved passerby to discover Anthony, understand what had happened, reach the nearby telephone box, and make the first emergency call. For the first time, detectives could test the anonymous call against measurable facts instead of assumptions. Paperwork had become evidence. The timeline had become a test. The reconstruction pointed to one conclusion. The person who made the first call was far more likely to have witnessed the attack than to have stumbled across it by chance. A timeline could suggest that. It still couldn't prove it. Detectives were left with a new problem. If the reconstruction was right, how could they ever prove who made that phone call? The reconstructed timeline had changed the investigation. It still hadn't solved the case. Detectives finally understood how Anthony Littler's last minutes had unfolded. One question remained. Who made the first 999 call? The timeline established what was possible. It ruled out what wasn't. What it couldn't do was identify the anonymous caller. Detectives revisited every conventional line of inquiry. The original witness investigation had already run its course. Fresh public appeals produced nothing. The physical evidence offered no second chance. The exhibits collected in 1984 were gone. No DNA remained to test. No murder weapon remained to examine. Everything the investigation had relied on was already gone. If detectives were going to prove the theory, the evidence would have to come from somewhere else. That forced a different question. If the physical evidence had disappeared, what evidence could still survive after 40 years? The answer wasn't hidden in a laboratory. It wasn't buried in an archive. It lived in the memories of the people who had been there. Memories fade. Truth doesn't always fade with them. That realization changed the investigation once again. Detectives concluded there was only one realistic way to test the timeline. They needed to hear people speak naturally, without realizing they were talking about a murder investigation. An undercover operation was authorized, not because detectives knew who had killed Anthony Littler, not because they expected a confession. Every conventional investigative option had already failed. The timeline had pointed them in one direction. Now they needed evidence strong enough to prove whether it was right. One question remained. What would people say about the night Anthony Littler died if they believed nobody was listening? The decision had been made. The timeline had taken the investigation as far as it could. Now detectives had to test it in the real world. They called the operation Snowpitch. Its success wouldn't depend on asking the right questions. It would depend on waiting long enough to ask them. 2 undercover officers were selected. In court, they would be known only as JJ and Anna. Their assignment wasn't to solve a murder overnight. It was to become part of ordinary life. Officer JJ didn't start by asking about Anthony Littler. He introduced himself with something far more ordinary. A conversation about a broken communal lift in Michael Stewart's block of flats. That was the strategy. Nothing about the operation could feel like an investigation. Every meeting had to appear accidental. Every conversation had to sound natural. Weeks turned into months. The murder rarely came up. Building trust came first.
The police won't discuss the detail of the undercover operation, but court documents show that listening devices were attached to Michael Stewart's car and put in his home.
Detectives already understood that Michael Stewart and Anthony Stewart were different. Anthony was guarded. Michael had a reputation for talking. Operation Snowpitch was built around that distinction. As the relationship developed, JJ slowly guided conversations toward the past. Never suddenly, never forcefully. Always naturally. From the outside, almost nothing seemed to happen. There were no arrests, no search warrants, no public appeals. Only ordinary conversations between people who believed they were among friends. That quiet routine was the operation. Month after month, detectives listened, not for a confession, for the opportunity that had never existed in 1984. Eventually, it came. The undercover officers had earned the right to ask about the night Anthony Littler died. Every word that followed was secretly recorded. Now only one question remained. Would 40-year-old memories finally confirm the timeline detectives had rebuilt? For months, detectives had listened. They compared every undercover conversation against the timeline they had rebuilt from records written in 1984. Piece by piece, everything matched. The theory no longer stood on its own. People who had lived through that night were confirming it. The breakthrough didn't come from DNA. It didn't come from a forgotten fingerprint. It came from words. During Operation Snowpitch, undercover officers known in court only as JJ and Anna gradually earned Michael Stewart's trust. Conversations that began with everyday life slowly drifted toward the past. As Michael spoke, he described the attack, minimized his own role, and blamed the fatal violence on others. Without realizing it, he repeated details detectives had already reconstructed from the surviving records. That mattered. The timeline had predicted that whoever made the first 999 call had been present during the assault. The undercover evidence now pointed in the same direction.
And that 2 undercover officers befriended him. One agent called JJ, who got chatting about a broken lift in his block. The other, Anna, befriending him in a cafe. And Michael Stewart started talking. I know who it was. It was my brother and 3 of his mates. They were gay bashing. The victim, he said, was smashed over the head. And to Anna, it was my brother. The court heard there was no evidence Anthony Litler was gay. Michael Stewart later told police he'd just been at the top of the alley as a lookout. More than 40 years on, the moment he was finally arrested.
I'm not a murderer. I didn't have nothing to do with it. I was 14 years old when this happened.
Michael and Anthony Stewart were arrested. During formal police interviews, investigators tested the evidence one final time. Michael Stewart made the admission detectives had been waiting to hear. He acknowledged that he had been at the top of the causeway. His role, he said, was to act as the lookout. That single admission completed the reconstruction. It explained why the attack unfolded so quickly. It explained why the attackers escaped before police arrived. Most important, it explained the anonymous phone call. The caller hadn't stumbled across an injured stranger. He already knew Anthony Litler had been attacked. He had witnessed the assault. He knew an ambulance was needed because he knew exactly what had happened. Then he did something else. He directed emergency services to the area outside East Finchley Underground Station instead of the causeway where Anthony lay hidden in the darkness. Police searched exactly where they had been told. They found nothing. The call was recorded as a false alarm. For more than 40 years, investigators believed the anonymous caller had been an unfortunate witness or someone who had become confused in the darkness. The reconstructed timeline suggested something different. Operation Snowpitch proved it. The caller had been part of the events unfolding that night. The false direction wasn't the result of confusion. It delayed the search long enough for those responsible to disappear. Everything detectives uncovered pointed to the same conclusion. Train logs, the station foreman's statement, ambulance records, police communications, undercover recordings, formal interviews. None contradicted the others. Together, they described the same sequence of events. In March 2025, the Crown Prosecution Service authorized murder charges against Michael and Anthony Stewart. The case went to the Old Bailey. Jurors heard the reconstructed timeline. They heard the undercover evidence. They heard the formal admissions. They heard how a phone call dismissed in 1984 became one of the strongest threads connecting every stage of the investigation. On June 1, 2026, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty of murder. On July 10, 2026, Anthony Stewart received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Michael Stewart received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years. Anthony Litler never returned home from the short walk he had made countless times before. For decades, his family lived without knowing why. The answer had been hiding inside a 2-minute window, inside a phone call. In 1984, detectives heard that call and believed it had led nowhere. 42 years later, they realized they had been listening to one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. The story began with an anonymous voice asking for an ambulance. It ended with the truth behind that voice finally being heard. The phone call that once sent detectives in the wrong direction eventually led them back to the truth. If you want to see another case where one overlooked clue changed everything, click the video on your screen now. If you enjoy documentaries like this and want to help keep this channel going, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.